In 1294, a merchant traveling through the Mongol Empire refused the paper bills he was handed as payment. The notes were made of mulberry bark, stamped with the seal of Kublai Khan. The merchant knew gold. He knew silver. He did not trust paper. He was sentenced to death. That currency, the jiao chao, was not backed by gold in full. It was backed by the authority of an empire, and for decades, it functioned. Not because people chose to believe in it freely, but because the consequences of refusing were final. This was never just about paper money. It was about something more fundamental. The systems that made empires possible. The financial architecture that allowed the greatest powers in history to expand, endure, and outlast their rivals for centuries at a time. Every empire you have studied had armies. But armies need to be paid. Trade routes need to be protected. Deficits need to be financed. All of it runs on money. The empires that endured were not always the strongest militarily. They were the most financially engineered. Welcome to Financial Origins, where we trace the true roots of wealth, power, and the systems that shaped the modern world. Start with Rome. Not the Rome of gladiators and triumphs, but the Rome of tax collectors and mint masters. By the 2nd century AD, the Roman Empire stretched from the lowlands of Scotland to the deserts of Mesopotamia. Administering that territory, paying soldiers, building roads, distributing grain, required a financial system of extraordinary sophistication for its era. The foundation was standardization. Rome introduced a uniform currency anchored around the silver denarius. Before Rome unified the Mediterranean world, trade across its territories was slowed by dozens of incompatible local coinages. Rome changed that. A merchant in Carthage and a legionnaire stationed in Britannia could transact in the same currency. Commerce accelerated. Tax collection became manageable. Built on top of that foundation was the fiscal military link. Roman provinces were organized not only for governance but for revenue. Administrators collected taxes in coin. The same coin Rome minted. That revenue funded the legions. The legions kept trade routes open. Open routes generated more taxable commerce. It was a self-reinforcing cycle. But there was a vulnerability embedded in this system. When imperial expansion outpaced the revenue base, emperors needed other ways to cover costs. Beginning under Nero, around 64 AD, the Roman state started reducing the silver content of the denarius, minting more coins without acquiring more silver. Before Nero, the denarius contained approximately 95% silver. His reform brought it down to somewhere between 90 and 93%, a modest reduction at first, but one that set a precedent no subsequent emperor would reverse. By the reign of Gallienus in the 260s AD, the silver content had fallen to 5% or less. Prices rose significantly across the empire. Soldiers demanded higher nominal wages. The cycle that had sustained Rome began running in reverse. Rome's financial engineering kept it dominant for centuries. Rome's financial compromises accelerated its difficulties. The pattern was already complete, but the world would need to relearn it many times. Centuries later and thousands of miles to the east, the Mongol Empire was confronting the same fundamental problem from a completely different direction. By the mid-13th century, Mongol-controlled territories stretched from Korea to Hungary, encompassing what historians estimate at roughly 24 million square kilometers. The logistical challenge was extraordinary. Moving sufficient quantities of silver and gold to administer an empire of that scale was simply not practical. The solution was paper money, and it came with enforcement mechanisms that had no precedent in scale. The Yuan dynasty, formally established by Kublai Khan in 1271, issued state paper currency across its territories. This was not a new concept in China. Paper money had existed there for centuries. But the Yuan version came with an administrative requirement that made it different. It was the only recognized legal tender within the empire's domain. Refusing it was not merely unwise. Under Yuan law, it could be prosecuted as a capital offense. The system functioned in part because it was initially backed by reserves of silk and silver held by the state. The Venetian traveler Marco Polo, who documented his time in the Yuan Empire during the 1270s and beyond, described the currency arrangement with visible astonishment. He noted that the Khan's paper was accepted in all transactions as though it were pure gold, an observation that struck him as nearly incomprehensible, given that Europeans at the time knew only metal coinage. What sustained the system was not the paper itself. It was the institutional authority standing behind it. The currency worked because the empire maintained confidence in its value through law, administration, and consistent enforcement. When that authority began to erode in the 14th century, through fiscal overextension, political fragmentation, and loss of administrative cohesion, confidence in the currency deteriorated with it. Inflation rose, stability declined. In 1368, the Yuan dynasty fell. Same structure, different geography, different century. The sequence rhymed almost exactly with what Rome had experienced. Now move forward to 1694. England is at war with France, and the crown is facing a serious fiscal shortfall. King William III needed capital to fund his military campaigns on the continent. The conventional methods, direct taxation, borrowing from wealthy merchants, were insufficient for the scale of modern warfare. A more durable solution was required. A Scottish financier named William Paterson proposed a new kind of institution, a bank that would lend money directly to the government in exchange for the right to issue its own banknotes. Parliament approved the arrangement. The Bank of England was formally chartered on July 27, 1694. Here is how it worked. The bank raised £1.2 million from private subscribers and lent the entire sum to the government at 8% annual interest. In return, it received the right to issue notes against that capital and extend credit to private borrowers. The government had immediate liquidity, the bank had a reliable revenue stream, and the Crown had discovered something that would define the next 3 centuries of British power. It could finance wars, navies, and colonial expansion not by extracting wealth from the present, but by borrowing against the future. That insight became a strategic instrument. By 1815, after more than a century of near-continuous conflict, the 7 Years' War, the American Revolutionary War, the Napoleonic Wars, Britain's national debt stood at roughly 200% of its gross domestic product, a figure that, by conventional logic, should have signaled insolvency. Instead, Britain emerged from the Napoleonic era as the dominant global power. Its navy controlled the sea lanes. Its merchants directed global trade. The pound sterling served as the world's primary reserve currency. The reason was institutional credibility. British government bonds were considered among the most reliable investments available anywhere in the world. Investors trusted the framework, the Bank of England, Parliament's authority over taxation, the consistency of English commercial law. That trust transformed debt into an instrument of sustained power. Standardization creates efficiency. Institutional authority creates trust. And debt, when that trust is sufficiently robust, can be wielded as a tool of expansion rather than a mark of weakness. Rome, the Yuan dynasty, Britain, these are not isolated stories. They are instances of a recurring structure that historians of economic thought have traced across dozens of civilizations over more than 2 millennia. The pattern moves through recognizable phases: expansion of the money supply to fund growth, institutional mechanisms to maintain confidence in that money, gradual pressure on those mechanisms as fiscal demands increase, and eventually either a managed adjustment or a disruptive collapse, followed in time by reconstruction. The Ottoman Empire reduced the silver content of its primary coin, the akçe, repeatedly through the 16th and 17th centuries, driving inflation that strained its provincial administration. The story of the Spanish Empire runs in the opposite direction and is equally instructive. Flooded with silver from the mines at Potosi in present-day Bolivia, Spain introduced so much new money into the European economy that prices roughly doubled over the course of the 16th century, in what historians call the price revolution. Spain, which owned the source, paradoxically failed to industrialize while its trading partners built the foundations of modern market economies on the same silver flowing through their ports. The Dutch Republic offers perhaps the clearest early model of what came later in Britain. Amsterdam's financial markets in the early 1600s were the most sophisticated in the world. The Dutch East India Company, the VOC, became the first corporation in history to issue publicly traded shares in 1602. Dutch government bonds carried low interest rates because investors trusted Dutch institutions. That access to inexpensive credit-funded exploration and commerce that made a small nation, with no significant natural resources, the wealthiest economy in the world for much of that century. Across all of these cases, a consistent logic emerges. Controlling how much money exists and where it flows is equivalent to shaping the material conditions of life within a territory. And public debt, far from being a sign of weakness, becomes a form of strategic leverage when the institutions behind it remain credible. If this kind of analysis, tracing the financial architecture beneath the surface of history, is the kind of thing you want more of, consider subscribing and leaving a like. We explore these patterns every week on this channel, and there is a great deal more ground to cover. The seventh element in this structure is perhaps the most subtle. It is the management of collective confidence. Currencies are, at their foundation, systems of shared agreement. A coin is worth what people collectively accept. A banknote is worth what the issuing institution can credibly sustain. A government bond is worth what investors believe will be honored. At every point in the history of empire, financial systems have depended on maintained confidence, and every significant financial collapse has begun with a fracture in that confidence, often long before the underlying material conditions made collapse inevitable. The same structure is observable in the present. The United States dollar has served as the primary global reserve currency since the Bretton Woods agreements of 1944. Like the pound sterling before it, the dollar's central position in international finance rests not simply on American military capacity, but on institutional trust, confidence in the Federal Reserve's independence, in the depth of the Treasury bond market, and in the legal framework governing American financial contracts. The United States national debt surpassed $34 trillion in 2024. This figure is frequently cited in public debate as evidence of unsustainable trajectory. Historians, however, offer a more calibrated perspective. Britain carried a debt burden of approximately 200% of its gross domestic product following the Napoleonic Wars and remained the dominant global power for another century. What determined the outcome was not the size of the debt, but the durability of the institutional trust supporting it. China's economic trajectory over the past 4 decades contains recognizable elements of the same cycle. The gradual internationalization of the renminbi, the creation of multilateral lending institutions such as the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the use of infrastructure financing as a diplomatic instrument across multiple continents. Historians of empire would recognize these as the moves of a state building the institutional architecture required to expand its monetary reach. The European Union's monetary union presents its own version of the challenge. A shared currency managed without a unified fiscal policy creates structural tensions that students of Roman monetary history would find familiar. Peripheral economies, unable to adjust their monetary conditions independently, exposed to the consequences of a centralized currency they do not fully control. The sovereign debt pressures that emerged across southern Europe between 2010 and 2015 reflected, in structural terms, dynamics that have precedent in imperial monetary history. None of this implies that history repeats in identical form. The institutions, technologies, and geopolitical arrangements of the present are genuinely distinct from those of Rome or the Yuan dynasty or 18th century Britain. But the underlying dynamics, the relationship between monetary credibility, institutional integrity, public debt, and sustained power, operate with a consistency that rewards careful attention. Why do these patterns recur across such different civilizations and centuries? The answer lies in the incentives that governing power creates. Every administration facing a fiscal shortfall confronts the same temptation: defer the cost, reduce the metal content, borrow against the future, issue more notes. The specific mechanisms shift across time. The underlying incentive does not. And the logic by which confidence eventually fractures follows an equally consistent path. Trust in a monetary system is rarely lost in a single moment. It erodes gradually, through each incremental compromise, each unfulfilled commitment, each departure from the institutional norms that made the system credible. until the accumulated weight of those departures becomes too great to sustain. What is perhaps most striking, across all of these histories, is how long that erosion can remain invisible. Rome's monetary difficulties developed over more than 2 centuries, from the first significant debasement under Nero to the full inflationary consequences of the 3rd century. Britain's debt-financed dominance lasted long enough that observers in 1900 would have considered the national debt irrelevant to British global power. The Yuan dynasty's paper currency functioned for generations before institutional decay made it untenable. Economic memory tends to be short. Institutions are constructed precisely to extend that memory, to preserve and enforce commitments that governments, responding to immediate pressures, would otherwise abandon. When those institutions remain coherent, systems prove resilient across extraordinary stress. When they are gradually weakened, through political pressure, fiscal overextension, or the slow accumulation of exceptions, fragility grows quietly beneath the surface. The cycle does not require any particular intent. It requires only the ordinary tendency of those managing complex systems to address today's constraints with resources borrowed from tomorrow. History rarely announces what it is doing in advance, but for those who study its financial architecture carefully, the patterns have always been legible before they complete themselves.